This is my house. That's what I kept saying to myself over and over, standing in my own kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, watching my son-in-law pour himself a coffee without asking, without even looking up, like I wasn't there, like I'd already stopped existing in the place I'd lived for 31 years. I'm 64 years old. I worked 40 years in the trades, pipe fitting, mostly in Northern Ontario, and I built a decent life. Nothing flashy. A 4-bedroom house in Sudbury, a truck that still runs, a pension that covers the bills if I'm careful. My wife, Doris, passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and after she went, the house felt too big and too quiet at the same time. My daughter Leanne was living in a bachelor apartment in Hamilton with her husband Gary and their 2-year-old boy, Finn. They were struggling. Gary had lost his job at a distribution warehouse when the company downsized, and Leanne was doing part-time bookkeeping from home. They couldn't afford Hamilton rent on one irregular income. I knew that. So when Leanne called me in March and said, "Dad, I hate to ask," I told her before she even finished the sentence, "Come home, both of you. Bring Finn. There's space here. And family doesn't let family rent a basement suite from a stranger when there's a bedroom sitting empty." That was 27 months before Thanksgiving. The first few months were fine. Better than fine, honestly. Having Finn in the house, watching him learn to walk properly, hearing him laugh at the dog next door through the front window. It brought something back into those rooms that had been missing since Doris passed. Leanne cooked some nights. Gary shoveled the driveway without being asked. We ate dinner together most evenings. It felt, for a while, like a real household again. I set a few ground rules from the start, and I want to be clear about that. Because later, Gary would act like I'd sprung something on him. The rules were simple. No rent because family. But help with groceries when you can. Keep shared spaces tidy. And don't bring drama into my home. Those are the words I used. Don't bring drama into my home. I thought I was being clear. I thought we understood each other. Gary smiled and shook my hand. He said, "Of course, Gordon, you have my word." I should have written it down. The shift happened gradually, the way these things always do. It didn't arrive one morning like a notice on the door. It crept in. First, it was small things. Gary changing the thermostat without asking, setting it to 22 degrees when I've always kept it at 19, because I'm 64 and I grew up with a father who said you wear a sweater in the house until February and you like it. I mentioned it once. He turned it back down. The next week it was up again. I left it alone. Then he started having his friends over on Friday nights, not asking, just telling me Thursday afternoon, "Hey, a couple guys are coming over tomorrow to watch the game." Fine. I understood he was cooped up, looking for work, needed some social time. But the couple guys became 5 or 6, and the Friday nights stretched past midnight, and they were loud in the way that men who think they own a space are loud. I'd come downstairs once for a glass of water, and Gary was holding court in my living room, like it was a bar he'd rented for the evening. He introduced me to his friends as Leanne's dad, not as the men whose house they were sitting in, not even by my name. Just Leanne's dad. I went back upstairs and lay in the dark and told myself it was fine. He was going through a hard time. You give people room when they're going through a hard time. Then the grocery money dried up. Leanne mentioned it apologetically in September. Gary had found some contract work, but it was inconsistent, cash-in-hand stuff, and things were tight. I said, "Don't worry about it." I kept buying the groceries, all of them, every week, $200 and sometimes $300 at the Loblaws on La Salle. Because there were 4 of us now and a toddler eats more than you'd think. I didn't track it. I should have tracked it, but I didn't, because tracking it would have felt like I was keeping score against my own daughter. What I didn't realize was that Gary had started tracking something else. He'd been mentally rearranging the house in his head for months, deciding what was his territory and what wasn't, building a little internal map of the place where his authority started and mine politely ended. I just didn't know it yet. By autumn, he'd started making comments, subtle at first. If we reorganized the garage, there'd be room for both vehicles. My truck and his Civic. I said I liked the garage the way it was. He said it didn't make functional sense to leave half of it as storage. He actually used the phrase functional sense in my garage about my storage that I'd been organizing since 1993. I smiled and walked inside. He moved some of my storage bins to make room for his car anyway. I found them stacked against the back wall when I went out for a screwdriver. Leanne was caught in the middle of all of this, and I want to say something about my daughter here, because she is not a villain in this story. She's a good woman who made the mistake of marrying a man who grows wherever he's planted, without asking if the soil belongs to someone else. She'd catch me after Gary said something and give me this look, half apology, half exhaustion. And I'd shake my head like it was nothing. I didn't want her to feel torn. She was already stretched thin between Gary's moods and Finn's needs, and trying to hold down her bookkeeping clients. I let too much go because of her. My grandson, Finn, was 3.5 by October. He had taken to following me around the house like a small, serious shadow. I'd be making tea in the kitchen, and I'd turn around and there he'd be, just watching me with those big eyes. We had a game where I'd let him press the button on the electric kettle, and he'd gasp every time it clicked, like it was the most astonishing technology in the world. That boy was the best part of every day. I want that on record. Thanksgiving weekend arrived. My sister Beverly was driving up from Barrie with her husband Ted. My old friend Hugh, we've known each other since high school in Kapuskasing, was coming with his wife Joan. 6 adults, a toddler, my house. I'd been planning it for weeks. I ordered a 20-pound turkey from the butcher on Notre Dame, made Doris's stuffing recipe from memory, started the prep the night before the way she always did. By 10 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day, the house smelled the way a house should smell on that day. Sage and butter, and the slow warmth of the oven doing its work. Gary had been in a strange mood since the night before. Quiet but tense, the way he got sometimes when he felt like things weren't going his way. I didn't know what was underneath it. Leanne had mentioned they'd argued about money the previous evening, but I'd stayed out of it. My sister and Hugh and their spouses arrived around noon. We had drinks in the living room, some apple cider I'd picked up, a bottle of Cab I'd been saving. It was good. It was warm and easy, the way Thanksgiving should be. Finn was showing Ted his toy excavator with enormous pride. I'd set the dining room table myself that morning. Extended it with the leaf Doris and I bought at a place in Manitoulin Island, the summer Leanne turned 12. Set out the good dishes, the blue and white ones that were a wedding gift that we only ever used for company. Put a candle in the middle. It looked like a proper Thanksgiving table. We were 15 minutes from sitting down to eat when Gary came into the dining room and started moving things. I was in the kitchen checking the turkey when I heard the chairs scraping. I came to the doorway. He was pulling 2 chairs away from the end of the table and dragging them toward the wall. "What are you doing?" I said. He didn't look up. "Rearranging. We'll fit better this way." "I already set the table," I said. "There's plenty of room." "This works better." He said it like that, final, flat, not a discussion. I stood there for a moment, and then I went back to the turkey, because my guests were in the other room, and I was not going to have a confrontation in the middle of the afternoon with my sister watching from the hallway. We sat down to eat. I went to take my usual seat at the head of the table, the chair I've sat in for 30 years, the chair where Doris used to sit across from me, where we ate 10,000 meals together. Gary was already sitting in it. I actually stopped walking, just stopped, standing there like an idiot, looking at him sitting in my chair. He looked up and said, and I will remember this sentence for the rest of my life, "I thought you could sit over there." He gestured to one of the chairs he'd pulled aside, the ones now pushed against the wall, away from the table, like overflow seating at a wedding for guests the bride forgot to properly account for. The room went quiet. My sister looked at me. Hugh looked at the table. Joan suddenly found her napkin very interesting. Leanne, I could see from the corner of my eye, had gone pale. "I'm sorry," I said. I don't know why I apologized. Habit, maybe. Canadian reflex. "You'll be more comfortable there," Gary said, and he had the absolute nerve to say it with a kind of practiced reasonableness in his voice, like he was doing me a favor, like he had thought this through and decided it was better for everyone, most especially for me. And then my grandson looked up from his plate with those big, steady eyes and said, "Grandpa, why aren't you sitting in your chair?" That was the moment. I know people say things like, "That's when I snapped," and they mean they got loud. They mean they lost control. That's not what happened to me. What happened was the opposite. Something in me got very, very still. Finn had asked the exact right question in his 3.5-year-old voice, and the answer was obvious, and I had been walking around for 2 years pretending it wasn't. I looked at Gary. I said calmly, "I need to speak with you in the kitchen." He started to say something. "Let's just eat, it's not a big," and I said, still calmly, still quietly, "Kitchen. Now." He came, I'll give him that. He followed me in and crossed his arms and leaned against the counter with the air of a man who expects to receive a mild talking to, and then return to the table, having won by not caring. "You need to understand something," I said, "and I need you to hear it clearly because I'm only going to say it once. This is my house. That is my table. That is my chair. My wife and I bought that table in 1997. You are a guest in this home, Gary. You have been a guest here for 2 years, and what you just did in front of my friends and my sister is the last thing like that that will ever happen in this house." He looked at me. Then he did the thing I was afraid he might do. He smiled. Not a warm smile. A dismissive smile. The smile of a man who has talked his way out of situations before and believes he can do it again. "Gordon," he said, "you need to relax. You're getting worked up over a chair. It's Thanksgiving. Everyone's watching. Don't embarrass yourself." I want to be honest. Those words hit. For a second, just a second, the old instinct kicked in. The one that says, don't make a scene. Don't be difficult. Keep the peace. Doris used to call it my turn the other cheek until there's nothing left to turn problem. She wasn't wrong. But then I thought about those storage bins against the back wall of the garage. I thought about $280 at Loblaws last week. I thought about Leanne's dad. I thought about the thermostat set to 22 degrees in my own house while I put on an extra layer and said nothing. I thought about Finn asking why Grandpa wasn't sitting in his chair. "I'm not embarrassed," I said, "but you should start thinking about where you're going to be living in 30 days. He stopped smiling. "What? What?" "I've been looking into this," I said, and that was true. I had, quietly, over the past 3 weeks, because some part of me had known this was coming even when I didn't want to admit it. I'd spoken to a lawyer friend, Bob, who I knew from the Legion. In Ontario, people who live in a home as lodgers without a formal lease are considered licensees, not tenants. They have fewer protections than tenants. A written notice in 30 days is what's required in most informal arrangements. I had written that notice. It was in the top drawer of my desk in the office upstairs, because I had made myself prepare it before I knew for certain I'd need it, because I am my father's son, and my father believed in having paperwork ready. I told Gary what I'd learned, quietly, factually, without raising my voice. He told me I was joking. I told him I wasn't. He told me that Leanne would never agree to this. I said, "This is between you and me right now. You can speak with Leanne later." He pushed off from the counter. For a moment I thought he might shout. I could see him doing the calculation, deciding whether anger would help him. It wouldn't, and some part of him knew it. Instead, he walked back to the dining room. I heard him say something low to Leanne. I heard the front door open and close. I picked up the oven mitts, took the turkey out to rest, and went back to the dining room. I sat down in my chair. Beverly looked at me across the table. She's known me for 64 years. She can read me better than anyone living. You okay? She said quietly. I think so, I said. Let's eat. And we did. We had a good Thanksgiving. Finn sat on the phone book we used as his booster seat. The same phone book I'd been using as a booster seat for 30 years, starting with Leanne when she was small. And he ate half a dinner roll and declared the rest too much bread, with great authority. Hugh told the story about the fishing trip in 1987 that he's told 100 times, and I laughed like I hadn't heard it before, because with Hugh you always do. Gary didn't come back to the table that evening. The next 2 weeks were hard in a different way than the drama had been. Leanne was devastated. We had a long talk the night after Thanksgiving, just the two of us at the kitchen table after Finn was asleep, and she cried and I cried a little too, and I want to be clear that I was not angry at my daughter. I told her that. I told her that my door was not closed to her, and it was not closed to Finn, not ever, but that I needed her to understand what her husband had been doing in the place that was my home and her childhood home, and that I could not allow it to continue. She knew. I could see that she knew. She'd been watching it happen and hoping it would somehow resolve itself the way things sometimes do, and I understood that hope because I'd had it myself for 2 years. I followed through with the notice. I had Bob look it over, and then I gave it to Gary formally in writing on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. 30 days. He said almost nothing when I handed it to him. He took it and went upstairs. He and Leanne found a place in the new Sudbury area, a 2-bedroom apartment on LaSalle, ironically enough, about 4 kilometers from my house. Gary had picked up a steady contract by then doing logistics coordination for a mining supply company, something he'd found through a connection, proper employment this time with benefits. I don't know the details. What I know is they had an income and they found a place and they moved on the 28th day of the 30. Finn cried when they loaded the last boxes into Gary's car. He didn't entirely understand what was happening, only that Grandpa's house was being made smaller in some way he couldn't explain. I picked him up and held him and told him he could come back any time he wanted, and that his room, because I'd started calling it that, his room, the one that had been the guest room, would always have his toys in it. He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist the way toddlers do and said, "Even the excavator." "Even the excavator," I said. He seemed to find this satisfactory. Gary and I have not spoken much since. At Christmas, Leanne brought Finn over for Christmas morning, which was the agreement we came to. He shook my hand at the door and said, "I know things could have gone better." That was the entirety of it. I said, "Yep," and stepped back to let my grandson through the door. Is it what I wanted? No. What I wanted was what I had in those first few months. The warmth, the sound of a kid in the house, the feeling that the place was being lived in the right way again. I didn't want to become someone who served notice on his own son-in-law. I didn't want any of this. But I am 64 years old, and I have learned, slowly, sometimes painfully, but I have learned that a kindness without a boundary is not really a kindness. It is an invitation. And some people, when you leave the door all the way open, don't come in as guests. They come in to redecorate. My sister called me the week after they moved out. She said, "I want you to know that what you did at Thanksgiving, not the fight part, but the chair part, sitting back down in your chair, that was the most dignified thing I've seen in a long time." I didn't feel dignified at the time. I felt tired and sad, and more than a little old. But Finn was here last Saturday. He pressed the button on the kettle and gasped like it was magic. Same as always. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches at my table, at my end of my table, and he told me very seriously that excavators are better than dump trucks, a position he holds with the conviction of someone who has thought deeply about the matter. The house feels right again, not the same as it did with Doris. Nothing will ever be that. But right in its own way. Mine again, in the way it should have stayed all along. I keep thinking about the kettle. About Finn pressing that button and gasping every single time, like the click of a switch is still somehow a miracle. That image, that small, ordinary moment, is what I come back to when I try to make sense of everything that happened in this house over the past 2.5 years. What Gary did didn't happen overnight. That's the part people don't always see from the outside. It was the thermostat, then the garage, then the Fridays, then the groceries, then the chair. Each thing by itself was something you could reason away, could absorb, could chalk up to stress or adjustment or giving someone the benefit of the doubt. And I did. I gave benefit of the doubt until the account was empty. That's not a virtue. I know that now. What I mistook for patience was really just avoidance wearing a patient man's coat. There's a version of me that stays quiet at that table, that takes the seat against the wall, that eats the meal he cooked in the house he owns and says nothing, because the guests are watching and it's Thanksgiving and what's a chair really? That version of me exists. I felt him there for about 3 seconds before Finn asked his question. And then something shifted. What I've learned, not quickly, not comfortably, is that being decent doesn't mean being a pushover. Those are two different things, and I confused them for a long time. Real decency has a spine in it. It says yes when yes is right and no when no is necessary, and it doesn't wait for the situation to become unbearable before it speaks. I should have spoken earlier, I know that. The first time Gary moved my storage bins without asking, I should have said something direct and meant it. That would have been the honest thing, the right thing. Doing right by someone includes being honest with them, even when honesty is uncomfortable. The intelligence part of this, and I don't mean book smart, I mean the kind of knowing that comes from paying attention, is that I eventually did see what was happening. I saw it slowly, but I saw it. And when I saw it clearly, I prepared. I talked to Bob. I wrote the notice before I knew I'd need it. I didn't react from anger. I acted from understanding. That distinction mattered. Gary expected me to shout. He was ready for a fight. He wasn't ready for a man who had already done his homework. And the will to actually follow through. That's the thing that cost me the most. Because following through meant watching my daughter cry at my kitchen table. It meant Finn crying by the car with his little fists. It meant choosing what was right over what was comfortable and sitting with the weight of that choice through a long November. But the house is mine again. Finn was here last Saturday. He pressed the button on the kettle and gasped. Some things are worth protecting.